The honourable member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, on December 14th, I raised with the Minister of International Development the numerous media reports of UNWRA employee involvement in the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack against Israel. I asked if the minister still held the view that regardless of an UNWRA employee literally holding an Israeli citizen hostage, he still regarded UNWRA as a trusted agency. Mr. Speaker, this is important because unlike the minister, several UNWRA donor countries, our allies, didn't share the same glowing view and quickly suspended funding to UNWRA pending an investigation. Mr. Speaker, how is it possible for UNWRA to be held in such high esteem by the minister and the Liberal government when evidence indicates UNWRA is joined at the fanatical hip of Hamas? Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the minister was at least able to admit allegations against UNWRA were very disturbing and that Canada's concerns had been expressed to the head of the agency. These concerns should be clearly conveyed because, Mr. Speaker, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear this, but Canadian taxpayers are not keen to be funding a listed terrorist organization. Mr. Speaker, on February 1st, in response to my question, the minister said the government was awaiting the results of the UN investigation and didn't want to jump to conclusions. But the investigation's final report is scheduled to be published on April 20th. And the Liberal government restored UNWRA funding on March 8th. Does the minister have the secret ability to time travel? Mr. Speaker, did the government know something that no one else did? It didn't wait for anyone to jump or not to jump to any conclusions. It simply made up its own. Moreover, on March 8th, the day the Liberal government reinstated funding to UNWRA, despite an ongoing UN investigation and despite the fact that the government had been briefed with additional information that very morning of that same day. So, Mr. Speaker, what led Canada to jump the gun on resuming UNWRA funding? I thought the minister had said they would wait for the results of the investigation. How would the Canadian government know what the final report has found when the investigation is not finished and the report hasn't even been published yet? Instead, Mr. Speaker, let us examine what the Liberal government did know prior to its decision to restore funding to UNWRA on March 8th. They knew that Hamas is deeply embedded in UNWRA and in key posts. They knew that Hamas members dominate UNWRA's education system. They knew that Hamas uses UNWRA facilities for military activities. And they knew that UNWRA's education system incites hatred and glorifies suicide bombers. And on that Friday afternoon, on March 8th, when the Liberal government reinstated funding, they also knew that at least 15 UNWRA employees were involved in the October 7th terror attack. And they also knew that nearly 2,000 employees of UNWRA, more than just a few bad apples, Mr. Speaker, but 1 in 6 UNWRA employees are members of a terror organization. That is the extent of what our government knew, Mr. Speaker, and yet they still decided to reinstate funding. Mr. Speaker, let's not stop there. They also knew that there are at least 6 UNWRA principals in Gaza who are Hamas members. And as well, 11%, or 1 in 9, of UNWRA's facilities contain terror infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, what kind of madness has permeated the government of Canada to restore funding to an agency more concerned with the advancement of terror than it is with any humanitarian work on behalf of the innocent Palestinian people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We unequivocally condemn Hamas's brutal terrorist attacks on October 7th, which included the killing, maiming, and abduction of innocent civilians. Nothing can justify these abhorrent acts. Canada continues to support Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international law. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, Canada has been deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and its impact on civilians. Since the start of this crisis, our position has been centered on the firm belief that more assistance is needed in Gaza, not less. Canada was the first G7 country to provide aid and is one of the largest donors, with $100 million provided for civilians so far, but much more needs to be done. And we have done airdrops, and we are now exploring ways to have a sea corridor to get this vital aid to the innocent civilians. À la suite, délégation solo.
Following allegations that some members of UNWRA were involved in the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on October 7, 2023, the United Nations put in place a number of important processes to respond to those allegations and strengthen its zero-tolerance policy with regard to terrorism within its organization, including UNWRA. Canada examined the interim report by the United Nations Internal Control Services Office on the issue and awaits its final report with interest. Canada salutes the independent review of UNWRA, which is currently underway, headed by Catherine Colonna. Although this investigation is continuing, UNWRA has undertaken efforts to reform its organization, and the Secretary General has taken measures to strengthen oversight and responsibility within UNWRA. Canada will continue to work in close collaboration with the United Nations, UNWRA, and other donor countries to ensure that UNWRA will respect its obligations and can continue its emergency work.
Making a serious process of investigation, action, and long-term review. On March 8th, Canada announced it would resume its funding to UNWRA. Other donors have done so as well, namely Sweden, Australia, and Ireland. And the European Union has proceeded with its disbursements to the agency. We will continue to closely follow the investigation. Civilians' needs for humanitarian assistance are growing by the hour. Famine is projected at any time in Gaza. There's a need for essential supplies and services to reach Palestinian civilians. UNWRA has an important role as a provider of food assistance to over 1.1 million people and sheltering over 1 million across 150 emergency shelters, most of which are in UNWRA schools. Each day, UNWRA provides around 23,000 medical consultations, recreation activities to 11,000 children, and psychosocial support to over 9,000 people. The agency represents a lifeline to the vulnerable civilians in Gaza. We assess UNWRA to be an indispensable partner in aid delivery in Gaza at this time of profound humanitarian crisis, and we continue to support the organization's valuable provision of services in other areas of operation across the region. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. No one is against Canada funding any organization in Gaza or elsewhere in the region that actively seeks to provide humanitarian assistance and a better life for the Palestinian people. That's not in question. Mr. Speaker, the Palestinian people need every assistance and support they can get to live in a just and durable peace. So does Israel. But it's unconscionable, however, to fund an agency that has been so deeply infiltrated by Hamas terrorists. Unless UNWRA can clean up its Hamas infiltration, Canada cannot continue its funding and cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the militarization and ideological takeover of UNWRA by Hamas. This Liberal government needs to take its legal and moral duty to safeguard and protect Canadian taxpayer dollars seriously, ensure that we're not funding terrorism, and find the courage and political will to find a real solution to getting innocent people the humanitarian aid that they need and deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, la communauté internationale.
The international community must continue to provide humanitarian aid to those in desperate need in Gaza. On January 30th, Canada announced additional humanitarian aid of $40 million to help the most vulnerable Palestinian civilians.
$100 million. As is the case for all humanitarian and development funding to the Palestinians, our additional assistance will be subject to our robust, enhanced due diligence process to ensure that no funding gets into the hands of terrorist groups like Hamas. Let me be clear. We are going to continue to remain focused on getting more aid to the innocent civilians in Gaza. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.